Okay, in our lesson, in this video, we're going to look at writing equations from word problems. When you get done, I want you to be able to explain the steps to writing an equation from a word problem. Walk us through how we do it. So please make sure your notebook is set up. You can cut out the little space on your word note sheet so that when we're done, we can fold it all up. And I want us to look at the first problem together. Please read it to yourself. And the first thing it's asking us to do is to define our unknowns right here. And what this is saying is, what is it that we don't know? What is it that we're trying to find out? What is it we're trying to answer as the problem? And in the question it says, how many of each kind were sold? So when we're talking about each kind, we're talking about how many, with the number of hamburgers with cheese that we sold, and the number of hamburgers without cheese. This is an old little abbreviation for without that we used to use when we wrote notes before you guys used to text. So that's what that means, and I use that a lot. So we actually can define this a couple of different ways. It says that the number sold with cheese was half the number sold without cheese. So if I wanted to, I could call without cheese X. And when I define with cheese, we still have to define it with X because we haven't learned different variables yet. So if with cheese is half of without cheese, then I'm going to call it 1/2 X. Another option, which may be easier, is to say that with cheese is X and without cheese is 2X. I'm going to go ahead and use the 1/2 X and X just so I can demonstrate something about a fraction that you may have forgotten. So now we're going to write an equation. And so if they sold 495 hamburgers, that means together, which means we're going to add, right? So 1/2 X plus X has to equal 495. Okay, so we've got some like terms here, so let's combine that. That's 1/2 X equals 495. And definitely you could change it to a decimal if you wanted to. I'm going to change this to an improper fraction. That would be 3/2. And I'm going to remind you that when we have a fraction coefficient like this, then we can divide by 3/2. That's the inverse operation. But when we're dividing, remember, we're basically just multiplying by the reciprocal. So I can multiply both sides by 2/3. Okay. And so when I do that, I get that X is 160. Nope, that's not right. X is not 165. Yes, it is. X is 165. Okay. I did something wrong. I'm using my notes, and I did it backwards on my notes. X is 330. Okay, so now let's look back at what we said. We were using this right here. And so if X represents 330, then 1/2 X has to be half of 330. And that's why I was getting confused because I had my answer backwards. So 1/2 X is 165. So let's sum up what we just said here. Basically, we're saying that Bert sold 165 hamburgers with cheese. I'm going to abbreviate because I'm out of room. And he sold 330 hamburgers without cheese. Sorry about that. Okay, see, it's okay to make a mistake. We just got to fix it and make sure that we're doing it right. Okay, let's look at the next problem. Please read it to yourself. Our unknowns here, we don't see, it says if the total was 236, how many students bought the deluxe cap? So we need to know the number of deluxe caps that were sold. Well, in order to figure that out, don't we also need to know the number of plain caps? Okay. Now, it doesn't really give us a comparison like it did in the first problem. So since we're looking for deluxe caps, let's go ahead and call it X. And so how do we know how to define plain caps? Well, if 40 students bought caps and X of them bought deluxe, wouldn't it make sense to say 40 take away the X, take away the number of deluxe would equal how many plain caps? Think about that for a second. Then the next thing we know is we know the total cost. So we know the total cost was $236. We know the deluxe caps cost $6. So could we show the cost as being 6 times X plus the cost of the plain caps, 4 times 40 minus X? So we've written an equation that has to deal with cost. Okay, so let's do some solving here. We're going to distribute. Okay, we're going to combine some like terms. I'm going to use a different color now. 2x plus 160. Okay, let's go ahead and subtract. Okay, and then if I divide by 2, I get x equals 38. Now let's go back to how we defined it. We said that x was the number of deluxe caps, and that is exactly what we were looking for. So we don't have to go and plug it back in to find out plain caps unless you just really want to. So we might say that the number of deluxe caps sold was 38. Remember, at any point, if you need to pause the video to write something, to think through something, to rewind, then please take the time to do that. Okay, our last problem, perimeter. Our last statement says, find the width and the length. That's always a good place to look for what you need to define. So we don't know the width of our rectangle, and we don't know the length. It says that the length is 5 meters greater than the width. So it's describing the length using the width. So I'm going to call the width W. And I like to use variables sometimes that deal with what we're looking for. So you can use any variable you want. The length is 5 greater than the width. So greater than here is indicating add. So W plus 5. Now the second thing I want you to think about before we write the equation is how do we find the perimeter of a rectangle? Perimeter is just adding all the sides. Remember, we have 2 widths and we have 2 lengths. That's a big piece that a lot of times we mess up. So when we think about this, when we write the equation, since we have 2 widths, 2 times the width plus 2 times the length, which we defined as W plus 5. And it told us that the perimeter was 150. I want you to see, now that we have the equation written, I want you to see if you can finish solving that equation by yourself and determine what the length and the width are. When you get done with your notes, you can take, let me zoom out a little bit, you can take your foldable if you'd like, and you can fold it up so that it fits nice and neat on your page.